I would like to pass now the floor to our third speaker, Dr. Arman Թաթոյան. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, dear friends, human rights are universal values that do not recognize borders or political boundaries. Violations of human rights must be properly documented, investigated, and perpetrators must be held accountable. Most cruel violations take part when these are parts of well-organized plans or systemic policies, when perpetrators know that their violations or crimes are sponsored by their governments, including when they are based on ideologies promoted by certain governments, and knowing that there will be no punishment. Challenges increase and human rights protection becomes even dangerous during crises, including emergency situations and armed conflicts. Mr. Ambassador has just mentioned about the possibility of governments to request derogations during emergencies. Yes, there is this formal possibility. However, from human rights perspective, this is a very challenging mechanism. Human rights violations and interferences in this context, unfortunately, may become even attractive for governments without proper control mechanisms from the side of national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and of course, the international community. They try to show sometimes that they have a legitimate excuse, emergency or a martial law, a military offensive. And of course here standards must be very clear. People do not have to tolerate. People are not obliged to tolerate failures of their governments and excuses, and they're hiding behind political or economic interests, including failures even from the international human rights organizations. National human rights institutions have tremendous role in ensuring proper documentation of human rights violations, collecting facts, verifying evidence, and presenting them to the international justice and monitoring bodies. Civil society organizations also play a tremendous role in human rights prevention, protection, and promotion. It is important that national human rights institutions directly assess the situation on the ground. This is the reason that applying to national human rights institutions must be absolute, with no subject to any limitations. These are independent institutions, meaning NHRIs and civil society organizations, which must complement each other. Their reports and statements must be taken into due account not only by the governments, but also by international community, more specifically international human rights organizations. International community must stay by their side, and this must be done in a way that governments realize this. Human rights protection becomes especially challenging when there is no reaction from international community in response to reports coming from national human rights organizations or civil societies. Despite the fact that national human rights institutions document violations, collect facts on the ground, but in cases when there is no reaction. And the natural question arises then, why this may happen? And why there may be no reaction coming from international community in response to concrete violations? Is this fact because political and economic interests may prevail over human rights? Because it becomes politically not popular in a specific context, or politicians would not endorse these activities. There should not be any room for impressions that human rights protection is popular when there is an enabling political environment on international arena, when actions of international human rights community will not cause anger of politicians, meaning specifically international community. Sometimes it feels that international human rights organizations may react because there is a specific comfort zone, and these are applications, for example, gathered by national human rights institutions and reflected in the reports. Unfortunately, sometimes international organizations even compete with each other in a negative sense, which negatively affect human rights protection. And of course, international engagement is not an end in itself, but a tool to fight against violations, to prevent further violations, and to prepare grounds for responsibility, to exclude even feelings of impunity for perpetrators and the governments. There is a very beautiful principle proclaimed by the United Nations, by European Union and other international organizations. No one should be left behind, no human right ignored. Is this a beautiful expression, an illusion, or a principle that has real effects for everyone in the world, and whether it helps people regardless of the fact what are political and economic interests, or it helps because of human rights prevail over everything. In reality, human rights must neutralize political interests and politicians and to be on the top of political agenda. Is this going to be a principle that works only for crisis situations, that is promoted only by human rights organizations, or has some other context? Unfortunately, lack of reactions encourage new crimes. This gives new violations, and this gives rise to impunity, to new crimes and new violations. It is very important that national human rights institutions feel support from international community, and the same goes for civil society. Unfortunately, governments are, again, just to reiterate, that for governments it is also attractive to hide themselves behind these crisis situations and to show to the public that how much they care about public interests. But human rights institutions and civil society, despite all the difficulties, must react very effectively, and despite the challenges and danger, despite the threats for their personal security, they have to react to produce, to verify evidence, and to prepare reports. But of course, staying objective and having as a perspective the possibility, creating the possibilities and supporting, pushing forward responsibility mechanisms for certain violations to prevent them in the future. Thank you very much.